Actually, this is my second time in this show. I'm actually interviewing a Nobel Prize laureate. So before that, it was Robert Oman. I had interviewed him around 2 months ago, I guess. And when I asked him, like, how does it feel to be a Nobel laureate, he used to say, nothing like that. It's just a simple thing. So, how do you feel actually becoming a Nobel laureate?
Well, it's a great honor. In my case, it was rather unexpected since I was at that point, I had been involved in academic administration rather than my kind of research life. Um, but that was a while ago. It was, I guess, 24
20.
years ago,
Yeah.
roughly,
Yeah.
23 or 4. Um, I mean, the only other thing I would say is, I mean, we had an interesting time because 2001, which was the year that, Joe Stiglitz, George Akerlof, and I received the Nobel Prize in economics, or what they call the Bank of Sweden Prize in economic sciences in honor of Alfred Nobel. There's a story behind that. The subset of the Nobel, um, you know, family as it came down through the century were didn't want to add economics, right? So they ended up with a compromise. So it's the name is actually different, although nobody really cares. But anyway, it was the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize, and so they invited everybody back who was still alive. There was something like 700 and some odd Nobel Prizes in all fields in the
Okay.
first 100 years. So a fair number of them were still um, alive. So they all came back. It was a pretty interesting, it was a pretty interesting and
Yeah.
somewhat different experience. I subsequently went back to Stockholm when Tom Schelling received the Nobel Prize, not long after 2001. I can't remember the exact year. Um, and I think he was there with Bob Bauman, actually. Uh, I may have got that wrong, but anyway. So they say you can come back and anytime you want and join in. I thought they don't really mean that, but they did. They meant it anyway. So the short answer is I think the Nobel Prize, especially for people in fields like economics or the sciences, makes who are people sort of vaguely know that there's something going on in physics and chemistry and biomedical science, but they don't really know who they are, right? So the Nobel Prize makes you visible in a fairly dramatic way, in a way that you weren't before and would probably never be. So I think that's a thing that is produces a fairly sudden change in your life.
And you still love it.
Well, I think it creates opportunities, and for most of us, I would say it creates some responsibilities as well. Um, to shine a light on the opportunities for younger people in the next generation. I think this is a particularly interesting time, with multiple really exciting breakthroughs in, technology and the sciences and the intersection of these things and so on. So, I think most of us spend part of our time try to be, ambassadors for some of the better things that human beings do.
Yep. You said that you feel good to be an ambassador for better thing. But right now, if we read articles in media, I mean, there are quite a lot of medias in recent times. So many articles are published such that they would say this might sound quite controversial, but the Nobel Prize is quite rigged. They say that that is not given to the deserved people in the recent days. Since you are also a Nobel Prize winner, do you think that Nobel Prize is rigged?
No, no, not at all. Um, I mean, I think, I don't know who writes those things, and,
But
I
yeah,
don't mean to be
there are many articles there. I think you
I
have
don't
also
mean to
read.
be, no, I haven't seen them. So I don't know exactly what they have in mind, but Nobel Prizes are essentially selected by field by a group of, you know, scholars in various fields in Sweden. um, and they do a very thorough job. At least from my point of view, the choices that they've made in fields that I know something about are not controversial, and wisely chosen. I mean, any individual can have different views about the relative merits of various kinds of research, but overall, I think they do their homework. And an interesting aside that most people don't know is that Alfred Nobel's will, the part of it that created the Nobel Prize, um, is just a single piece of paper, and the bottom sentence, the last sentence on that piece of paper, says something like, "Under no circumstances will this prize be confined to citizens of Sweden or citizens of Nordic countries."
Okay.
And so everybody says, well, that's not very interesting. Well, it turned out it was. So the monarchy in Sweden sued to have that provision overturned so that they could confine it to, citizens of Sweden.
Yeah.
And the Nobel um, family, most of whom were engineers, and they executors of this will, defended it successfully. The monarchy lost. Um, and so the Nobel Prize is open to people from anywhere in the world who are doing interesting and important, or what they judge to be important work. Um, and the interesting thing about that is if the monarchy had won, you would have never heard of the Nobel Prize. I mean, there would be distinguished scholars from Sweden, but Sweden's
Yep.
a country, of 10 million people, not a world of 7 billion. So I don't know where the sense that it's rigged comes from, but that's not even remotely close to my experience. And I would think the vast majority of other people that I've had the privilege of knowing who've had the honor of receiving this prize.
And do you think that policymakers from any country around the world give value to theories proposed by Nobel laureates like you and other people?
Well, it depends. I mean, sometimes, I suppose, uh, let's take the sciences. I mean, policymakers in general, I think, appreciate the value of science because and technology because it creates opportunities for advancing the well-being of the people they represent. Right. So if you get the kinds of breakthroughs that we have seen over many years, and especially now in biomedical and life sciences, then this is ultimately, with a lag, gets used to improve the health, well-being of their citizens. So even if they're not directly interested in or even capable of understanding the underlying science, I think they appreciate the potential benefits for their citizens. In the social sciences, like economics, I think it's a little different because economics at times comes closer to policy things, and therefore, there are times when it's more controversial, and so that's a slightly different picture. But in general, I don't think the Nobel Prize people have, for the most part, tried to pretend they're, capable of. We're not politicians, for example, right? I think every once in a while, Nobel Prizes, people sign letters, you're urging certain things. I sometimes agree with those. I almost never sign the letter uh, because I prefer to express my own opinions myself. And maybe, some people may feel that when in doing that and trying to intervene in public decision making, they're overstepping the bounds. But I think for the most part, the recipients of this prize spend most of their time encouraging developments in the field that they um, are occupy and are recognized for.
And have you got any phone calls from someone like, okay, so we need some advice from you related to any economic related stuff that would help in developing their country?
Well, in the last 20 years or so, because my interest has been included
Yep.
the growth of developing countries. So there have been lots of opportunities to, I don't think I get phone calls from heads of state saying, "We need your help," but I've been involved in and lots of activities that are designed to help, um, leaders in countries and policymakers, formulate their own strategies for improving the lot of their citizens. And that's very rewarding. I mean, but on the other hand, usually in that context, you're a foreigner. And so it's not up to you to decide what the right course of action is. It's to answer questions as best you can that are, meant to be helpful in letting the people who really do have the responsibility make the best choices that they can.
Yep. And one thing that I find common in kids these days is that many kids have accused economists, telling that economists are just a good storytellers. And if anything good occurs, then they would make sound like, okay, because of them that happens. So you have any views regarding to this?
I'm not sure I understand. Is the allegation we're good storytellers? Uh,
Yep. So kids generally say that. So since the world right now is facing a lot of financial problems regarding recession and all those, so kids I have been hearing from them is that so economists they just tell a good story, and that's how it goes. So they do not contribute much to the economy. That's the allegation that I have been hearing quite a lot from kids these days.
well, maybe I should back up and clarify. I mean, while it's true
Yep.
that occasionally economists are, asked to offer advice on various policy choices, the fundamental purpose of economics is to try to understand as well as we can a very complex system that we use to allocate resources uh, in the various economies and in the global economy, and similarly for the financial system, which is a part of that complex thing. So there is an important part of economics, which is just taking something that's arguably as complicated as the human body and its various systems, including its neural systems, and to try to understand them. Nobody, I think, with any humility in my field claims that we have complete understanding of that, but perhaps we can improve our understanding of it over time. One element of difficulty in that is that it's a moving target.
Yep.
The thing that you're trying to understand in the year 1900 is not the same thing as the thing you're trying to understand in 2025.
Yeah.
Maybe young people think that economists just sit around and pontificate about policy things, but I would that's not a particularly accurate assessment of what's going on in the world. I mean, in many ways, economists deal with a different set of a different subject matter, but they're trying
Yep.
to do the same kind of thing that science is trying to do. At least it's not the only function they have. It's admittedly, economics is a pretty broad field. It runs from mathematical models at one end to detailed empirical work and policy oriented work at the other, and a lot of things in the middle. So, but I don't think the best or most accurate view of economics is to pick one end of it that happens to, intersect people's lives and assume that's all of economics.
And one question in my mind that commonly goes is like why it is so difficult to be rich today in 2025.
Well, it depends a little bit of where you are, right? I
Yep.
mean, uh, so if you look at the post World War II history, a lot of people who were poor are no longer poor. They're in a category called the middle class. That's an unbelievably gigantic number of people and percentage of the global economy. So at some level, uh, the the kind of long run story is pretty beneficial. Uh, I've called this convergence. It's the process. You see, the 200 years from the Industrial Revolution up through World War II were a period in which what we could now call the developed countries grew. And,
Yeah.
not only grew in size, but grew in per capita income and all kinds of other, related dimensions. But something similar did not happen in what we generally refer to as the countries that are in the developing world, emerging economies, and so on. But after World War II, that pattern changed, right? And while it wasn't terribly visible in the early years, I mean, it's very visible now.
Yep.
And there's been a dramatic increase in the um, in the economies of the developing world. Um, Growth rates we've never seen before. I mean, you cannot find in the history of any economy growth rates, of 7% for an extended period of time in the way you can in the post-war period. So but countries start at different points. So, and at any point when you look at it, the overall pattern is convergence toward developed status. But some countries are, at the start of that, and some countries are lagging behind. And it's true. There are still poor people in the world, and there are still people um, that live in low income countries that haven't really started growing at the pace that we know is possible because of this post war experience. So the job is not done. And I'm sure, one of the problems I think people have is they look at the world and they say, gee, there's a lot of inequality in the world. We ought to get rid of it. Well, the problem with that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the sentiment, but the problem with that is that if you look at even the most successful, full development experiences, take countries like Singapore or South Korea or the Taiwanese economy, or, China's pretty close now. India's growing fast and has probably got the highest potential growth rate of a very big economy in the world. Um, but even at very high speed, this takes decades, right? If you
Yep.
start in a low income status. And so there's no feasible way other than, trying to make it possible for every country to grow and then enter successfully this multi-decade process. There's no shortcut, right? There's no way to kind of fix it. Uh, and so, and do it kind of in a decade or a few years. You can make people's lives better, in through international institutions and creating options that weren't there before and so on. I mean, part of that has been the opening of the global economy, but I mean, but anyway, that's the reality that we're living with. I think of this, even in its most successful form, as a kind of century-long process. But it's a whole lot better to be in that process than be in the one that we were in before, where 85% of the world's population really weren't experiencing the benefits of the kind of growth we've seen.
Yep. But the problem right now that as a normal person I'm seeing in this world economy is the rich, especially if we call the billionaires, the elites, they are getting rich day by day. If we see the growth statistics of their wealth, it's increasing. And for a normal people, I mean, the pandemic came, one major thing that happened to the world, unfortunate thing. After that pandemic, layoffs started massively in many tech giants company and they lost their job. So
Mm-hmm.
for
Yep.
that reason also, I mean, a normal person would think that the economy right now is not fair. Though, as you said, that the growth is growing a lot, especially after the World War II, the post-World War era. But
Mm-hmm.
right now, the current trend, this says a lot things in a normal person reality.
Yeah, I understand where people are coming from, but I do think this tendency for, to focus on the very wealthy is a mistake. I mean,
Okay.
when I ask people, you know, but what it amounts to is talking, in kind of general terms. So I go around and ask people, um, you know, some of the world's best athletes have become fairly wealthy because of their athletic talent and dedication.
Yep.
Do you have a problem with that? Usually the answer is no.
No.
Well, well, what about Taylor Swift? Right? She's clearly wealthy. She's probably
Yeah.
a billionaire. Do you have a problem with that? The fact that she, spends, months touring the world at concerts that are oversubscribed? Usually the answer is no, right? And so when you actually get down to the specifics, people think, gee, in a world in which somebody with these kinds of talents, very special talents and abilities, I get the same answer. Is Steve Jobs gave us, the mobile internet and the iPhone 20 years ago, right? We
Yeah.
got relatively wealthy from that. Do you have a problem with that? No.
No.
I mean, so I think there is a problem, right? Which is not everybody is experiencing the gains um, in many economies, both developed and developing, and um, and and some are experiencing actual losses, right? Not just in terms of income and whatnot, but opportunity. And that's where I think we need to focus the attention, not on sort of hyperventilating about the top 1/10 of 1%. That's you know. So I'm happy to have a few people who are extraordinarily talented and have contributed something really quite special in various categories. Have that reflected in their income and wealth. And maybe a certain amount of redistribution is the answer, but I don't think it's the main event. The main event is to expand the opportunity set for the people for whom it's excessively constrained, either because it's hard to get a good education, or there's prejudice in the system, or the technology or some part of globalization is adversely affecting them in ways that they don't control, and so on. So, I mean, so this isn't to dismiss the notion of inequality, but I think the more fundamental question is: have we done the best we can to give the maximum number of people the kinds of opportunities that they deserve uh, to exercise their, desire to contribute to society and their creative talents? Um, and and so all of this discussion about, isn't it disgusting, that a few people are wealthy and a fairly large number of other folks are I think it's a distraction, to be perfectly honest with you. And what it does is it keeps us from focusing on what really matters, you know, which is for individuals one by one, do they have the kinds of opportunities we would hope they would have for the fullest possible kind of fulfillment, whatever their gifts, talents, preferences, and so on are.
You talked about the talents of Taylor Swift and some athletes, but they also fall under the category of some very less people. They are not the majority ones. The majority ones are working in some corporate sector, working as clerk, any other officer. So that was the main aim I was actually focused to.
No, but I'm talking about them too, right?
Yep.
So in America, for example, we have people whose lives have been sideswiped by globalization. And I think on balance, most people would agree we've done a fairly bad job of, sort of trying to right the ship for them, right? But that's not the same thing as complaining about, billionaires in the abstract. Is the point I'm trying to make,
Yep.
right? The point. I mean, if you want to do something about it, then focus on them and their opportunities and what they need to thrive again, uh, as they go forward, or create opportunities for their children and grandchildren. I'll tell you a story. I mean, when I first started looking at development economics and the growth processes, the question was, how does it work, right? And one of the answers to it is you need the global economy because just can't grow at 7% without both the global marketplace and the global technology, but mainly because the domestic economy is small and doesn't allow for specialization or anything like that. But the other component's investment, right? And when I and a group of other people, were members of a commission on growth and development, we decided you probably need investment rates uh, on the order of 25% or more of GDP, uh, which is a big number, right?
Yep.
so So then the question is that going to happen in a relatively poor country? And people's instinct is that it isn't. But the evidence is that people do that. Now, why do they do that? Why do they give up? Are they willing, with appropriate leadership, to give up 25% of what could be consumed today in a relatively poor country in order to fund the investment that actually drives progress? And the answer seems to be that if people believe that it's possible, believe in the vision and eventually the model, then the notion that their lives when they're older, but especially the lives of their children and grandchildren, will be better is a very, very powerful motivation. And it's the same motivation I'm trying to talk about here. I mean, we we successful development models, work when the objective is to make everybody better off over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's a focus we ought to have here. So, I mean, I'm not trying to tell people what to think, but my personal opinion is that that we should worry about poor people and loss of opportunity in the middle class when it occurs and other things, and not obsess about the upper end of the distribution.
So, what if we remove all the billionaires from this world? So, will the world economy will survive? The reason I am asking this question is because
So, what are we removing?
if we remove the billionaires, the
Oh, the
elites,
billionaires.
yeah, the
Yeah.
billionaires from the economy, so will the economy survive? The reason I am asking this question is because if
Hmm.
we look in China, they have disturbed the lives of many billionaires and still the country is growing economically far.
Yeah. No, I mean, I mean, the way to cause damage would be to eliminate the possibility for the next billionaire to arrive. Okay.
Yep.
Because to do that, what you have to do is eliminate the possibility of creating the next Alibaba, right? Or
Yeah.
the next DeepSeek, or the next OpenAI, right? If you do that, you will crush
Yeah.
progress, right? But I mean, as a thought experiment, you could eliminate the existing billionaires. I don't mean eliminate, but sideline them, uh,
Yeah.
and probably that's not a fatal. Uh, with respect to the future of the economy, that's probably not fatal. And I don't think anybody thinks that's a particularly good idea, but I mean, then it gets complicated. I mean, you get power struggles and whatnot. So there's in the United States, there's talk about whether the tech billionaires have become too powerful politically. There's a history of this. The American antitrust law, which is
Yeah.
the core of the competition policy in the United States, was passed in the 1890s, and it's called antitrust precisely because the trusts were believed to be becoming too powerful politically. And most people, at least in democratic countries, don't think that the politics should be dominated by wealth or money or economic power, but rather by other considerations. And that's a perfectly legitimate view. And there's a tug of war, in many countries between these things, um, that needs to be won by the people who want to promote the general prosperity as opposed to special interests. There's no question that's a recurring theme in most of the global economy.
And for the betterment of global economy, do you support globalization?
Yeah, if it's done carefully, but I mean, the main event in the post-war period um, that enabled the kind of growth that and prosperity that we've seen was the opening of the global economy,
Yep.
basically. Um, Before that, we had, tariffs, closures, Great Depression, you know, and the interesting thing historically, I think, is that in the post-war period, the main reason for opening up the global economy was to accelerate the process of war recovery.
Yep.
Uh, it wasn't about development, you know, in various parts of Asia and Africa. But that turned out to be, one of the main events.
Yeah.
So globalization is defined by flows. Usually, when people think about it, flows of goods and services, flows of capital,
Yeah.
flows of technology and knowledge, and flows of people. Those four, right? And reasonable amount of openness, has to, I mean, there are practical considerations. You can't have everybody moving around all the world to their preferred country. I
Yeah.
mean, that's never going to happen. Uh, but but globalization, made those flows more fluid, and that was the core of the enabling. I mean, there's lots of work to do within a country to take advantage of this, but if you take those key elements away, you don't have access to somebody else's technology to adapt to your own needs. You don't have access to their expertise. Nobody can move anywhere. You can't sell goods to the global economy because it's not open, right? And by the way, you can't, there's no foreign direct investment. That's not allowed either.
Yep.
In that world, not much good happens, right?
Yeah.
So globalization in its most, at a general level is a good thing. Now, when you get past the general level, and ask, well, how fast, suppose you're a developing country, how fast and in what ways do you open up? That doesn't have a simple answer, like do everything tomorrow and then hope for the best, right?
Yep.
That's not a good strategy. And people and countries that have done that, it hasn't worked, right? So it gets a lot more subtle at that point. I'm not sure we want to get into it, but um, so I guess those are the two sides of the coin. I mean, globalization, if you respond to it practically and well, is an opportunity that we don't really want to take away. Uh, but completely open global economy in all the relevant dimensions is not necessarily a good thing.
Uh, as a person from developing country, what I find is globalization is quite harsh for countries like us. Why I'm saying is because a neighboring country of Nepal, Bangladesh. So
Mm-hmm.
it produces the most number of textiles. So companies such as Adidas, Nike, Puma, Levi's, all of them produce in Bangladesh.
Yep.
And while Bangladesh is still the poor country, the consumer nations such as United States, the Great Britain, and all those, their profits are increasing. But if we see the case in Bangladesh, it's not the same. It's still degrading. So that could be the problem
I
there.
I don't think that's right. I mean, I know that's what you're saying, but let's just see.
You don't
Do
see
you
them.
do you know
Sorry?
the um, pattern of the GDP growth in Bangladesh?
Not much right now. So,
No. So it's uh, it's growing kind of at very, very high rates ever since 2000. Uh, and people are better off. That doesn't mean they're as well off as the people in the countries where the multinationals that you just described are located. But that's the multi-decade journey.
yep,
So Bangladesh is actually a very high growth country. It will not be producing in another few decades. It will not be the place that produces, textiles, apparel, and shoes. But at this stage of its development, that tends to be, this is not a resource rich country.
Yep.
tends to be where its comparative advantage lies. And oh, by the way, its predecessors, right,
Yeah.
basically followed the same path. Uh, there's a phase in which textiles and apparel is a pretty natural element of comparative advantage, the way you engage with the global economy. So there's lots of challenges. Sometimes the nationals have to get criticized for, not caring enough about the lives of the people in their global supply chains and have to make corrections. And I think all of them, there are examples of them having to make corrections. Um, but I don't think you'd want to cite Bangladesh as a country that's sort of going nowhere. Not when you go look at the data on growth in the GDP and per capita income.
Yeah, but we cannot consider GDP entirely for the proper economic development.
Hmm, that's true. It's an incomplete measure.
Yep. So,
But
yep.
but one of the reasons people still pay attention to it, even though it's an incomplete measure, is that the things people really care about, because they don't care about growth for them.
Yeah.
That's just a statistic.
Yeah.
They, care about opportunity. They care about health. They care about education. They care about whether their, children and grandchildren are going to be, have opportunities that are at least as great or probably greater than what they care. But the sustainable provision of many of those things, take health and education, you know, as the country grows, its higher education system becomes larger,
Yep.
um, its healthcare system becomes more effective, etc. It's very hard to provide on a sustainable basis those things as they become better, unless you have rising incomes and a rising economy. So the reason we pay attention to growth is not because it describes what people care about, but because it's a necessary condition for the sustainable provision of the things they do
Yep.
care about.
And do you support free market economy?
I mean, if you mean, with the government as small as possible, the answer is no. I
Okay.
don't think that's a good model. No, nor is the other opposite end of the spectrum. Central planning doesn't work,
Yep.
and a minimalist government that does almost nothing except the absolute bare minimum, like defense and whatnot. I don't think that works very well. But there's a bunch of things in the middle where the government, the state, and the markets have complementary roles, uh, that I think does work very well. That an effective, relatively efficient government with the right objectives, investing in things that make the return to private sector investment higher.
Yep.
That's the kind of thing that seems to have worked, and it makes sense, right? I mean, private sector doesn't provide public goods at the appropriate level because the incentives aren't there. You need the public sector to do that. People think, they're great debates about this. Is the China model the right one, or the American one, or the European one? They're all different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the margin, they're different from each other. I don't think there's an answer to that. China one seems to work pretty well. The American one, they all have their flaws and they have their periods where they have challenges. Uh, China happens to be at a point right now where it's overcoming some imbalances that I'm sure they'll be successful at overcoming and kind of restore the growth momentum. In the meantime, it's clearly a sort of scientific and technological powerhouse comparable to the United States. Um, so it's not that you don't face challenges, but I think there's um, there's a range of models that work, and one of them is not market fundamentalism.
So most of the countries in today era, they actually work on the free market economy, and we have seen.
Can I interrupt? Yeah, meaning they work on a free market economy, meaning a component of how they
uh,
work
yep.
is a market economy with incentives, property rights, entrepreneurial activity, and stuff like that. But that's not the same thing as saying the government has no role in the economy. Okay,
Yep.
right. But just to clarify for your for your listeners.
Yep. And one thing that the market is quite unfair for the small economies like Nepal and all those developing countries, because I want to share one story. So in
Hmm.
the 90s, when India opened their market to the world, they went to the liberalization. So
Hmm.
many companies they entered India, and two companies, they were Coke and Pepsi. They also went to India to make their market. But the
Right.
problem that arose there was India had already a bunch of cold drink companies that were pretty successful at the time. So when Coca-Cola and Pepsi entered, they disrupted the market, and to their money and all those power, they destroyed all those cold drinks that are available in India. Right
Hmm.
now, they have been reviving since the nationalism factor is quite growing in India right now. But
Yep.
at one time, it got destroyed.
Hmm.
So this thing could also make a great problem there.
That is the issue of the pace and sequencing, right?
Yep.
So I remember it specifically a discussion of this. It's very similar. The Indian retail system is extremely fragmented,
Yep.
was and still is to some extent. Um, and so somebody said, well, we can fix that. You just let Carrefour and Walmart in.
Mm.
And the Indian policymakers said, no, we're not going to do that, right?
Yeah.
Because if they show up, they're going to blow away a whole lot of people who are, small merchants.
Yeah.
And we're not, it's just a stupid idea. And they didn't do it, right?
Yep.
And so that doesn't mean the whole thing's error free, but it means that the policymakers have to make choices about the speed with which these changes, structural changes, occur. There will come a time,
Yep.
in the Indian economy where the retail sector is not as fragmented as it is, but you got to get there from here. And from here, the answer is not, making several tens of million people unemployed and
Yeah.
without work. So you're absolutely right. I mean, these are subtle, it's more art than science, actually. You got to
Yeah.
figure out how to do this. You know where you want to get to, but that doesn't tell you what route you should take and how fast you should drive the car in order to get there. And sometimes people make mistakes. So, given the story you just told, it's probably a mistake um, to have, Pepsi and Coca Cola and a whole bunch of Western, producers of soft drinks arrive, en masse
Yeah.
overnight in the economy. Uh, this is no argument at all. Uh, and if you look at the history of developing countries that have succeeded, they have not on day one thrown open the doors. The reason you have special export zones in many countries
Yep.
is because these countries have high tariffs, and it's hard to start the export sector, with high tariffs. So they create a special zone where the imports, meaning the things you need to import in order to produce the things you're going to export, are not subject to the tariffs, right? But
Yep.
it's circumscribed, right? So you're not throwing the whole thing open uh, because it doesn't make sense to do that. Instead, you just open up the part you need um, to to jumpstart the export-led growth model, and so on. I mean, you know, we could go on, but I mean, but the basic idea is exactly right. You have to sort of figure out clever ways to get the things you want done without producing a massive amount of destruction somewhere else.
Yep. And just 1 or 2 months before, I guess, so Donald Trump shut down USAID. That was actually a source of income for many companies and for countries like ours, which is
Yep.
actually dependent on foreign funds. So, could this shift make any changes in the economies of countries like ours that is dependent on the foreign aid?
Well, it's a negative shock, uh,
Yep.
and as an American, I'm sorry we did that. I don't think it's a good idea. Um, it wasn't that expensive, given the size of our economy. Um, it gave us position in a whole variety of developing countries that, is the kind of position we'd like to have. And so I'm sorry we did it. I think it was, in some sense, a mistake. But we, had an election. The majority of Americans voted for this administration, and that's what they do. So you don't always get what you want, personally, what you want in a democracy. And but this is what I feel, I'm particularly sorry about.
And in long run, can this decrease the American influence power for other countries?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think in multiple dimensions, including this one, we're withdrawing.
Yep.
We have a short description would we had kind of tensions with China over some period of time, partly because of national security issues, intruding into economic issues. But we, have now boys more or less picked a fight with Canada and Mexico. I grew up in Canada, so I see this up front,
Yeah.
and Europe, right? So these would be traditionally viewed as our neighbors, friends, and allies. So
Yeah.
the question is, why are we picking a fight with them? I mean, there's an answer to that, I think, which is that the Trump administration believes that when the United States has a current account, a trade deficit another entity, there's something wrong. They cheated, or they're taking advantage of us, or something like that. You can hear this in the rhetoric,
Yeah.
right? Now, it's not conventional economics, but that's kind of what they think. And so that makes it easier to understand why we picked a fight with neighbors, because our biggest current account deficits, bilateral deficits, are with China, Europe, Mexico, Canada, Vietnam, and Japan. And
Yep.
that's 85% of the total $1 trillion deficit in
Okay.
2023. 85%. So we're picking fights with, friends and allies that people didn't expect. They're kind of shocked and whatnot. So we're I guess the last thing to understand. I mean, you mentioned USAID. I think they'll pull out of other things that involve, or they may pull out of other things that involve support for a variety of countries in the process of their growth and development journeys.
Yep.
Um, and the other thing that the Trump administration does not uh, support at all is multilateral solutions, right?
Yeah.
So they're pulling out of the institutions, the multilateral institutions that manage kind of the day-to-day interdependence. The World Health Organization. We haven't pulled out of the World Trade Organization, but we're, not particularly supportive. Uh, we'll wait and see what happens at the World Bank and the IMF, etc. Um, but this is an administration that prefers bilateral uh, activity and negotiations. And so I think, the question is then what happens to all the multilateral structures that we've lived with for so long, given that they appear, at least to me, to benefit a wide range of countries and are needed to maintain access to the global economy, to its technology, to its marketplaces, etc. And I think the answer to that is probably going to be that, the developing countries, emerging economies, many of which are quite large and powerful now, along with Europe, and maybe some other developed countries, but not including the United States, are going to have to kind of construct a workable version of globalization that has a multilateral structure. That process was already underway. I mean, the version of globalization that prevailed up until, I don't know, 10 years ago, was starting to break down anyway because of these geopolitical tensions and
Yeah.
shocks to the system. But but with the United States pulling out, if it's a durable, event, meaning, in a democracy you can change course every now and then, um,
Yeah.
and so. but for the time, for, at least for the the period when the United States is not interested in that aspect of things, it's a setback. Um, I mean, the obvious one, where it's a big setback is climate change, and the United States under Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord twice, once
Yeah.
before, and now again, and so that's it's hard to overcome that, but the rest of the world will certainly try.
And for small economies like Nepal, so is foreign aid actually necessary? Because I don't think that in long run this would help countries like ours.
No, I mean, foreign aid. I have a very specific view of that, which is that Bill Easterly and many other people, who policymakers in development. If you go back, 25 years in the West and say economic development, most people would think foreign aid. But anybody who knows anything, the leaders in any country, Nepal, India, whatever, would think, that's foreign aid and development are not the same thing. The main event in development is what happens internally in the country,
Yep.
right? Is whether it's well governed, whether the leadership group is trying to make people better off, whether they're making wise strategy decisions, or doing something else like trying to retain power or whatever. Uh, and then once you have a situation in which the process of development is going well internally in terms of governance and economic policy, then I think external help can make a difference, right?
Yeah.
But if you have external help for something that isn't working anyway, right, then that doesn't, just probably makes it worse rather than better. So, so the point is the main event is what happens internally. I'm assuming that there's a reasonably decent remaining global economy, in the surround, right?
Yep.
If that's not true, then everybody's on their own, and the growth won't be, to put it mildly, it won't be impressive.
Yep.
Uh, but after that, the main event is what goes on inside a country. Uh, and then and once that's going well, then I think external support, whether it comes from the World Bank or foreign direct investment from wealthy countries, because it will be controlled and managed domestically
Yep.
by people who are there to represent and promote the interests of the citizens of that country. So I think most of the examples of dysfunctional impacts of foreign aid of a variety of kinds come from problems that are associated with internal problems. You know, I mean, the simplest example is if you have a corrupt government and you have foreign aid, the foreign aid will disappear,
Yep.
right? I guess, the simplest example of that. So the people who say foreign aid is not the main event are right, in my view. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have it and available to support the countries that are doing a good job of advancing their development agenda.
Yep. And another problem for countries like ours that we are facing quite a lot in the modern economy is that so Nepal is actually a landlocked country, so we do not have any direct access to the sea.
True.
And due to this complication, so the cost of making in this country is very expensive. So when our products goes to other countries and our products also need to compete with those products, and also they face a huge lot of tariffs, and that makes our product more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So what strategy should countries like ours adopt in order to make our product go and compete in the international market?
Well, there's no simple answer to that. I mean, digital technology is changing
Yep.
what it means to have a comparative advantage in labor intensive things. It hasn't done it completely, but it's in process. Right. Well, it won't take too many more advances in robotics before, that source of comparison. So the short answer is everybody has to think about this.
Yep.
Um, and the answer is, you need a more robust services economy,
Yep.
including services that are deliverable internationally. You need an education system that supports that. You can't do it overnight, but that's the direction of movement. Um, and you need to be promoting the kinds of things that support entrepreneurial activity, right? So there's a massive increase in the developing world in the use of digital technology and specifically artificial intelligence to expand the opportunity set for people in the financial system, right? Over time, these things seems this is a sustainable version of microfinance. You can lend money to people using data where the traditional banking system, just can't do it, right?
Yep.
Literally can't do it. Uh, you need to lend money to people who A, have an identity, B, have no collateral, have a little tiny business or a family business or whatever. That's all possible now. And every country should be focused on it. These are inclusive growth patterns.
Yep.
Uh, and over time, if everybody does their job, there won't be anybody that doesn't have a bank account or the ability to borrow money, you know, or a safe way to save, etc. Um, and that's in process. I mean, it's the revolutionary development in India with a unified payment system and
Yeah.
the geo revolution and whatnot. That should happen everywhere,
Yep.
and to some extent it is. But that's the policymaker's job to make sure country X, whatever it
Yep.
is part of this process. That you have entrepreneurial talent solving local problems, that you're using powerful technologies like the digital ones, which keep improving. Um, use them in the right way to advance the inclusiveness of not finance, the economy, education, healthcare. I mean, the opportunity sets are pretty big. Uh, and expanding. So I think, it's not a complete answer to the question, what do you do with a landlocked country? But at least the things that are obviously available, uh, need to be promoted to the maximum. And then, we'll see how far we can get.
And as you just mentioned about the new transaction system and all those related things, so currently we can see the rise of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and all those things. So do they bother you?
Well, I mean, it depends on which one, So, blockchain is probably an interesting new technology for
Y-
securely keeping track of what's going on. It'll get used in supply chains, where it's kind of hard to know where these products have been.
Yep.
If you don't have a technology like that, I'm somewhat less enthusiastic about crypto assets. Perfectly honest, I don't think of them as currencies, except for people who want to hide their transactions. Um, I mean, a currency, if you study economics, is sort of a means of exchange and a store of value. And these assets have there's lots of people investing in them, so it's hard to deny they're an asset. But the volatility as such is a little hard to defend it as a store of value. So I don't think they're going to replace fiat currencies or central bank digital currencies, which is the direction of evolution of the fiat currencies. The fiat, I mean, there's an entity called a central bank that
Yep.
decides how much money there
Yeah.
is. So I think the notion of fully decentralizing financial systems is not a realistic objective. Having said that, there's a lot of people investing in cryptocurrencies,
Yep.
and so they've obviously established themselves as having a place in the financial system as an asset that people find interesting. Um, I'm not one of those people, but maybe I'm just too old to understand it.
So 1 month ago, another Nobel laureate, Eugene Fama, said that Bitcoin in 10 years would be zero. So you also somehow agree on his statement, I guess.
No, I'm not sure it'll go to zero. I mean, it's. I think it depends a lot on policies. I mean,
Yep.
So there are places in the world that have essentially said they don't want to have people speculating in cryptocurrencies, and they banned it.
Yep.
So that would be a zero. Uh, but other places, I don't see anybody banning cryptocurrencies in the United States anytime soon.
Yeah.
Uh, at least certainly not under this administration. So I might not be that extreme, but
Yeah. But right now, one thing that is currently evolving in the economic related topics is the thing called de-dollarization. The
mhm,
talks about de-dollarization is extremely massive, especially if you hear in countries like South Asia and Southeast Asia.
yeah,
This talk is going a lot. Do you think
yeah,
that de-dollarization will succeed?
eventually, yeah, right. I mean, so, uh, but don't hold your breath, right?
Okay.
So the United States still is dollars is still the main reserve currency
Yep.
in the world. Uh, so the question is, can you replace it, and what would you replace it with?
Yep.
Uh, so any small economy's currency, is not going to work because it'll, you try to make it a reserve currency, the inflows and outflows will create volatility
Yeah.
that can't be withstood. So now we're down to big economies. Well, sometime India's economy will be big enough,
Yep.
and I wouldn't be surprised if my children see at a time when the Indian currency is a reserve currency. Just ditto the Chinese currency, but one of the features of a reserve currency is that you have to be able the capital account has to be open. You got to
Yep.
be put money in, take it out, um, and uh, and that you don't want to do until you're ready, right?
Yep.
So I don't think China's ready to open the capital account completely, which means that puts a limit. I mean, the Chinese current China's about over 30% of global manufacturing.
Yeah.
So the use of the Chinese currency in trade settlement, I think, is growing and
Yep.
will continue to grow because of its dominant position in that area.
Yep.
Um, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. It's more efficient, you know, than settling trade in somebody else's currency that had nothing to do with the trade, right? It's relatively an efficient way to do things. Um, but so I think the dollar will hang on as a reserve currency because, and to take Europe, in
Mm.
principle, Europe's a big enough economy, but they don't issue in volume European bonds, right? So when you look at, I mean, the core of a reserve currency is the sovereign debt because it's supposed to be the safe asset, right? In the United States case, it was treasuries and, it's government bonds and in any other potential case. But in Europe, the sovereign debt is German sovereign debt and Italian sovereign debt and French sovereign debt, etc. And these are medium-sized countries,
Yep.
medium-sized markets. And the big market, the one that if Europe were organized differently financially, would be the European sovereign debt market, but it's not very big at all. So
Yep.
the euro is, not uninteresting as a way to hold reserves, but it's not likely to displace the dollar anytime soon. So I think what you're seeing is people want to avoid giving the United States the kind of control
Yeah.
that goes with having the reserve currency and SWIFT and the payments mechanism and so on for understandable reasons, especially when the use of sanctions increases because of wars, like the
Yeah.
Ukraine war, um, and and probably there'll be movement in that direction, but it won't. When I say don't hold your breath, it won't happen anytime soon. And the main reason is the absence of an alternative. I mean, you
Yep.
can imagine a world in which the dollar is tarnished enough that people really don't think of it as a sufficiently safe asset.
Yep.
Uh, in which case, my view of that world is that if we get to that point, we don't have a reserve currency, right?
Yep.
I mean, there just isn't one, and that'll probably create some instability. But I think that's where we are.
Can Russia take the spot? Because they are also trying a lot of hard work.
Who
Russia.
is Russia?
Yep.
See, I mean, Russia's a nuclear power, um, and uh, and whatnot. But Russia is a kind of medium-sized, middle-income economy,
Yeah.
basically, with a lot of natural resources. Uh, so it has a kind of outside influence in its neighborhood. But to be honest with you, the economy isn't big enough. Uh, I think I mean, even now, you know, Russia's kind of global influence, I think, is heavily dependent on support from China.
Yep.
If you pull China out and put them on the other side or on the sidelines, I think the Russian economy's ability to support uh, broad influence in the global economy, hard and soft power, military, etc., is limited. Uh, the Russian economy is about the same size as the Italian economy,
Okay.
and nobody thinks Italy is a future, dominant power in the global economy. So I think it's just in a different league
Yep.
from, you know, Europe acting as a whole, uh, China, India, United States, and some of the major emerging economies are very influential. Indonesia, potentially Brazil.
So right now we should, I think, not remove the topic from our conversation is about artificial intelligence. I mean, this topic is everywhere. People
Okay,
are,
well, I'm going to run out of time, so let's finish with artificial intelligence. Okay,
yep. So,
fire away.
yep. So, what do you think about artificial intelligence in the economy? Will it hamper the economy of countries?
Mm-mm. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's an enormously powerful, rapidly developing set
Yep.
of technologies. Most people encounter it, because of generative AI, large language models. That's not all
Yep.
of artificial intelligence by a long shot. The deep mind breakthroughs in biomedical science. The predicting of the uh, three-dimensional structure of proteins. That's not generative AI, but it is AI. So I mean, the short version of what I think is that you will see an immediate impact
Yep.
in the sciences, because the the because it's powerful and they'll pick up these tools and use them. Just that simple. In the economy, it's a slightly different story. I mean, powerful technologies will have big long run effects, and at
Yep.
least I'm in the camp that properly steered and regulated, it has the potential to produce pretty much everywhere an enormous productivity surge. And the reason for that is it's very hard to find a place in the economy where you can't use it, right? I mean, it does everything, right? Writes the first draft of everything, helps doctors use their time efficiently, writes computer
Yep.
code, answers questions. I mean, think of it this way. This is just the generative AI models. If I told you 25 years
Yep.
ago that everybody on the planet, with a internet connected phone, and that's a growing fraction of the world's population, was going to have a digital assistant. No, wait a minute. A digital assistant who's read everything. I mean, read everything in
Definitely
every
not.
field. You would have said that's crazy,
Okay.
right? Well, that's what we've got. Every person in the world, speaking whatever language they want, in a very short period of time from now,
Yep.
is going to be able to answer any question we want. Tell me the history of, early Nepal, right? Could you tell me about the Italian Renaissance? Please produce an app that does the following things, etc. A few seconds later, it's going to come, right? Now, I mean, so the people who think this is going to have no impact, have a pretty, weak case as far as I can see.
Yeah.
The question is, how are we going to use it? So there's tons of businesses out there who are trying to figure this out. What's the best way to use it? Do we, enhance consumer experience? Do we just use it to replace people? Is it just full-throated automation and whatnot? All of these things are being discussed and debated and thought about strategically in an uncountable number of enterprises and whatnot. And that's before you get the people and artists and people who make movies and all kinds of things. So it's pretty confusing right now, but it won't take forever to sort that out. So I think the economic impact is not going to be immediate, but eventually will be multi-decade and very large. That's the kind of short version of it. And the reason is that it takes time to figure out how to use it, and people keep getting new ideas, right? And furthermore, the technology itself is a moving target. I mean, 6 months ago we didn't have DeepSeek.
Yep.
Now we have a cheaper version of a generative AI model.
Yeah.
The Chinese company has sort of
Yeah.
provided and made available.
Chat.
So, so
Yep.
I think, so it's not a complete picture. Nobody knows where we'll be in 5 to 10 years,
Yep.
but I think the magnitude, both in the economy and in other domains, especially the sciences, is just going to be enormous.
And lastly, so I actually wanted to ask your opinion about something in economics that you believe, according to you, is true, but most economists disagree upon.
The vast majority of economists regard as nonsense, or rubbish, or not, just simply not true. There, no, I can't think of anything in that category. I mean, I think all of us in any field, have things that we understand better and other things that we understand
Yep.
less well because we spent less time on them or something like that. So I would fit into that category. There's some things I think I understand that, the majority of my colleagues probably haven't spent as much time on, and vice versa, right? I mean, I don't,
Yep.
I don't spend most of my time um, thinking about what, macroeconomists normally think about,
Yeah.
even though development things overlap with macro things. But um, no, I don't think so. Uh, I think there are, cycles in economics. We went through a cycle where the economic theory was dominant. We're now in a cycle where empirical economics is much more prominent, and people look for natural experiments, or they actually do experiments. So behavioral economics is a
Yep.
major addition. Um, and any version of this can, be carried slightly too far. I mean, I don't know how many biases we now have documented in the way people think about the world and behave. That comes from
Yep.
behavioral social science. And
Yep.
but on the whole, I think the direction of movement is. But I can't think of anything where I think the whole. I mean, it'd be a little arrogant if I thought the whole profession were sort of had missed the point and gone off on the rails. So
Yeah. Okay. So that's it. Thank you so much, Mike, for your
yep.
time. It was great talking with you.